This is the top 10 dead live service games of 2024. I have compiled a list of games that released this year and have either officially shut down by developers or indications displaying that it may eventually shut down. But when do we actually consider a game to be dead? While an official shutdown may be the clearest sign that a game is dead, low player numbers are often the first indication that things are going downhill for a live service game. So what really matters is the player numbers. What do the numbers mean?
The numbers, basically. What do they mean?
And so starting off with number 10, we have Tribes 3 Rivals, which launched in early access in March 2024 with a mixed review rating on Steam, and it peaked with just under 1,000 players on launch day. It's a team-based first-person arena shooter featuring gameplay modes like Capture the Flag, where two teams compete to capture the opponent's flag and return it to their base. You use jetpacks and skiing to push forward towards your opponents, and it includes 3 distinct armor classes that you can choose from: light, medium, and heavy. Tribes 3 was intended to be a successor to the earlier titles in the franchise, Tribes 1 and 2, games that were beloved for their large-scale battlefields, vehicles, and strategic elements. But Tribes 3 seems to be missing some of those features that players loved in the previous titles. The absence of vehicles, base assets, smaller maps, and reduced team sizes left the core audience disappointed, and players felt that the game lost its identity that made the Tribes series so special. The servers are still running and the game is available for purchase, but the last update was 6 months ago, indicating that developers abandoned their game and moved on. The people behind Tribes 3 Rivals are Prophecy Games, a subsidiary of Hi-Res Studios, and if you know anything about Hi-Res Studios, they have a track record of shutting down games like Realm Royale Reforged and Divine Knockout, as well as seizing updates for games like Rogue Company. If you search for the game on YouTube, you will find very few, if any, big streamers or content creators covering it. So with a lack of marketing and advertising, removing core features that made the previous titles amazing, launching as a $20 early access class-based arena shooter in an oversaturated market, and failing to provide meaningful updates before abandoning the game, it's safe to say that Tribes 3 was going to be dead on arrival either way. Coming in at number 9, we have Brighter Shores, a free-to-play MMORPG with an optional monthly subscription that launched in early access in November 2024 with a mostly positive rating on Steam and now averages below 2,000 players. This one is interesting because the founder of this game is the same person behind Old School RuneScape, a beloved 20-year-old MMORPG that is still played by hundreds of thousands of players. Brighter Shores has been in development for over 10 years and shares many similarities with Old School RuneScape, specifically its top-down and click-to-interact gameplay. However, it takes a more structured approach, being designed with episodic content where each episode introduces new regions, professions, and quests. Players retain their skills and items across episodes, but armor and weapons do not scale across regions, requiring constant upgrades. You also have auto-scaling for resources and mobs, which means you can technically keep leveling in one spot without needing to move to new areas. Unfortunately, Brighter Shores hasn't been able to replicate the same level of success as Old School RuneScape with this formula. Nearly all of the aspects in Brighter Shores is considered a downgrade by many players in comparison. The turn-based combat isn't as exciting or engaging. It doesn't have the same level of freedom and manipulation to do things in between. The repetitive gameplay and constant grinding seems to lack a sense of purpose. The lack of social and player interactions that are critical for an MMO, such as not having the ability to form a group, a guild, or do dungeons and raids with other players. And ultimately, the linear and structured gameplay that detracts from the sandbox experience. Now, Brighter Shores is still in early access, and the developers have plans to introduce more features before the game fully releases. They are actively working on updates to improve the experience, and I'm sure it will become a better game over time. However, with its current design and formula, I believe the game will continue to struggle with low player numbers, unless significant changes are made to how Brighter Shores is played out. Coming in at number 8, we have Pantheon Rise of the Fallen, a $40 standalone game which launched in early access this month with a very positive rating on Steam and now averages around 4,000 players. It's an old school MMORPG that started as a Kickstarter project 10 years ago and has been in development ever since. The game launched with multiple zones, classes, and races to choose from, and the developers have stated that Pantheon will likely have periodic wipes as needed. On the surface level, the game feels very rough. Most of the content requires grouping with other players, which can be a challenge challenge if the player count is low. There are no maps to navigate in the world, and you seem to be losing experience and items if you die. The game lacks many quality of life features, and bugs and glitches are common throughout the experience. The gameplay consists of a tap target system that isn't super engaging nor interesting to play with. Additionally, the graphics, user interface, and animations are outdated and stiff, making it difficult to appeal to a mainstream audience. Now, the game is clearly designed to be very niche because most MMO players today will not find this game very appealing. It may be able to find a hardcore audience that can support the development of the game, but with a $40 price tag for early access and so many other MMOs being free to play, it's hard to see this game last for a longer period of time. Generating enough revenue to sustain development and server costs seems unlikely without introducing microtransactions or other monetization strategies. But who knows, maybe the game will be able to increase the player numbers over time, or it may just shut down eventually. Coming in at number 7, we have Supervive, a free-to-play top-down MOBA battle royale shooter that released in late November 2024 with a very positive rating on Steam, and just a month later, the player base has dropped to around 4,000. Supervive combines the strategic elements of a MOBA with the fast-paced intensity of a battle royale. Players choose from a roster of unique characters, each with special abilities, and compete in shrinking arenas with objectives. It's a bit surprising to me to see low player numbers considering how polished the gameplay is. I did have fun playing the game at times, and I still think they can continue to improve it during early access and retain a core audience, because objectively speaking, it's not a bad game. However, there are some things I can think of that would make Supervive struggle to retain a larger player base. The overwhelming amount of particle and visual effects can make it hard to understand what is happening on your screen. It's a very fast-paced hero shooter that doesn't always cater to casual audiences. There are too many skill interactions, including abilities, consumables, items, and other objectives, which, again, can be overwhelming for new players. And finally, it's not the first entry to the genre. If you ever heard of a game called Battle Royale, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Supervive and Battle Royale has many similarities, and that game got abandoned by the developers a long time ago. Supervive developers also sponsored several content creators, including big names like K-Drill and Tyler 1, giving the game enough coverage and popularity. Now, the game isn't entirely dead, but has lost players very quickly, and it is still losing every single day. So we will simply have to wait and see if they can continue to improve the game and attract more players later down the line. Coming in at number 6, we have Spectre Divide, a free-to-play competitive first-person tactical shooter that released in September 2024 with a mixed review rating on Steam, and it's now averaging below 1,000 players. Its core gameplay revolves around selecting heroes or classes with unique abilities and winning rounds by planting or defusing the bomb. The gameplay loop is familiar to other games in the genre, but with a twist: the duality feature that allows players to control two characters simultaneously. This can enable strategic plays such as defending multiple sites, self-trading, or repositioning by swapping between characters in real time. Unfortunately, Spectre Divide fell short very quickly, despite sponsoring many popular content creators like Jack Frags, Summit1G, Valorant Pro Player 10s, and even Shroud. If you didn't already know, Shroud had invested time and money into Spectre Divide over the last 2 years, acting as one of the game's advisors.
Alright, so what's up, YouTube? I have been working on a game secretly for the past 2 years, and now that secret's out, and that game is called Spectre Divide, made by Mountaintop Studios.
Funny enough, he stopped playing the game himself after a couple of weeks and never streamed it again. He's pretty much abandoned the game entirely, acting like Spectre Divide never existed. I believe the game's decline can be attributed to several key issues: a lack of content with too few maps, gameplay modes, and other engaging features. No real progression system outside of competitive gameplay, such as battle passes, match history, or a replay system for players to review and improve. Launching the game with extremely high prices for cosmetics and skins, especially bundles which cost more than competitors offer. Generic and uninspired character designs, many gameplay elements that feel copied from other games like Valorant, and finally, releasing a hero shooter in an already oversaturated market. It's not surprising that the player numbers are so low, despite the heavy reliance on content creator sponsorships. They bank too heavily on the duality mechanic as their main selling point, but you can't expect players to leave two well-established tactical shooters like Valorant and CS2 for a game with so little to offer. Now, the developers have stated that they plan to release Season 1 in early 2025 with more content and features, but my prediction stands strong. I believe that a shutdown of Spectre Divide will happen next year. Coming in at number 5, we have Wayfinder, a single-player / co-op action RPG with a mixed review rating on Steam, and it's now averaging below 1,000 players. This might sound a bit confusing, because Wayfinder was initially published as a live service MMORPG in August 2023. At the time, the only way to play the game was by purchasing a Founders Pack for early access. However, just 3 months months later, the game's publisher, Digital Extremes, pulled out from further publishing. Airship Syndicate, the developers of Wayfinder, went into emergency mode, wiping all progress players had made and delisting the game from Steam in early 2024. Rumors began circulating that this move was made to avoid refunding sales to players, and instead, they relaunched the game in June 2024 as a single-player / co-op action RPG. Either way, Wayfinder is a game that is trying to blend dungeon crawling mechanics with ARPG-style progression. You can choose from a roster of unique characters, each with distinct abilities tailored to various combat roles. The core gameplay revolves around exploring instance dungeons, called Lost Zones, where players battle enemies, collect loot, and upgrade their gear. Looking at negative Steam reviews, it's clear that the performance issues have been a consistent problem for players, leading to frequent game crashes regardless of the device. Reports of corrupted save files forcing players to start new characters have only added to the frustration. It felt like the situation was already bad initially, when developers had lost trust from the community, not just for the game itself, but also in their decision to not offer refunds. Finally, I think the limited content and repetitive gameplay loop made it difficult to retain a larger audience. Coming in at number 4, we have Foamstars, a PlayStation 5 exclusive game that initially cost $30 to purchase and required PlayStation Plus to play, but has since then shifted to a free-to-play model after reports indicate that the game struggled to attract a substantial player base. The publishers behind this game are Square Enix, and they have decided to officially end support for season updates in this game. The main gameplay of Foamstars revolved around using foam to build terrain, surf around the arena, defend against enemy attacks, and eliminate opponents. While the game offered various modes to choose from, including the primary Smash the Star mode, it wasn't enough to retain a larger audience. Square Enix never considered expanding the game to platforms outside of PlayStation, and moving to a free-to-play model didn't seem to impact player retention either. Honestly, I never played this game, but from what I've seen, it's incredibly hard to tell what's happening on the screen. The visuals are overly colorful, with a lot of chaotic effects, making it difficult to follow the action. The game also didn't seem serious enough for competitive gameplay, and knowing how Square Enix likes to shut down their own video games, I don't believe Foamstars would have lasted either way. Coming in at number 3, we have XDefiant, a free-to-play first-person shooter developed by Ubisoft that was released in May 2024. The game started very strong, attracting over 3 million unique players in its first few days, and was even called the next Call of Duty killer by many content creators. For a brief moment, it seemed like Ubisoft finally had a hit on their hands. However, just months after its release, reports started coming out that XDefiant was losing a lot of players. And eventually, Mark Rubin, the game's executive producer, announced on Twitter that the servers will officially shut down in June 2025. The game was advertised as a fast-paced arcade shooter with factions inspired by Ubisoft franchises, like Far Cry, Watch Dogs, Tom Clancy's, and The Division. But if you know the history of these games, you would know that Ubisoft hasn't been delivering on their promises lately. Games like Watch Dogs Legion and the recent Far Cry entries left many players disappointed, and creating a free-to-play live service shooter during this time probably wasn't the best idea. XDefiant wasn't a terrible game, but it felt mediocre compared to other games in the same genre. It lacked enough content and didn't have a fun progression system to keep players coming back. On top of that, one of its biggest problems was bad netcode, with inconsistent hit registration that frustrated a lot of players. To make matters worse, when Call of Duty Black Ops 6 launched a few months later, it pulled even more players away. All of this contributed to the downfall of XDefiant and marked yet another misstep for Ubisoft. For number 2, we have Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, a weird name, but it's an action-adventure shooter developed by Rocksteady Studios, the creators of the acclaimed Batman Arkham series. The game launched in early access in February 2024 with a $70 price tag on multiple platforms. It now has a mixed rating on Steam and is averaging below 2,000 players on the platform. Many players were disappointed to see Suicide Squad turn into a live service game with battle passes and microtransactions. These elements overshadowed what could have been a great single-player or co-op experience, especially coming from Rocksteady, a studio known for story-driven gameplay. The always online requirement, even for a single-player mode, was another major frustration, feeling unnecessary and restrictive. The gameplay itself wasn't the best either. The repetitive mission design and uninspired combat mechanics left players feeling like the game lacked the creativity and depth Rocksteady is known for. The story, which had potential, ended up being an underwhelming follow-up to the Arkham series. On top of that, players complained about a lack of content, performance issues, frequent bugs, and the absence of polish. Reports even suggest the game cost Warner Bros. Nearly $200 million to make, further adding to its failure. We can only hope that they have learned their lesson. Finally, for number 1, we have none other than Concord, arguably the biggest flop of of the year. This sci-fi first-person shooter launched in August 2024, after reportedly costing nearly $400 million to develop. Despite the massive investment and hype surrounding its release, the game peaked at fewer than 1,000 players and struggled to gain any traction. With such low player numbers and overwhelming criticism, Concord has now officially shut down, marking a devastating end to what was supposed to be a groundbreaking title for Sony. You would pretty much select characters with distinct abilities and playstyles, as well as engage in team-based objectives across various maps. It brought a lot of comparison to games like Overwatch due to its hero-based mechanics and competitive gameplay, and I believe that's why Concord struggled to distinguish itself in the crowded hero shooter market. The gameplay itself wasn't the worst I've ever seen, but it felt very mediocre in comparison. Trust me, I have seen way worse games than Concord in terms of raw gameplay and mechanics. The real problem that everyone has already pointed out with Concord is the fact that it failed to capture one of the core appeals of the hero shooter genre, the heroes themselves. There was no clear sense of style or cohesion to the game's aesthetic, and it lacked the personality that games like Overwatch or Apex Legends bring to the table. You can't expect players to develop any attachments to these heroes when they are so boring and ugly to look at. This includes weapons, map design, and other objects that felt very generic generally speaking. The marketing campaign for Concord didn't help either, with trailers showcasing generic voice lines and uninspired one-liners that made the already bland heroes look even worse. Despite spending an enormous budget on these trailers, the lack of engaging content failed to resonate with the audiences. So many people were left unimpressed, and the trailers received a significant number of dislikes on YouTube. Now, let's take a look at the fact sheet for all of these games combined. 6 out of 10 games are published by indie developers. 6 out of 10 games were already dead on arrival, with very low player numbers after launching. 7 out of 10 games included live service elements, such as battle passes and microtransactions. And finally, 8 out of 10 games were either released in early access or allowed you to purchase a digital edition, which would grant you access to the game earlier than everyone else. At the end of the day, these are just opinions, so take it with a grain of salt. Either way, if you liked the video and would like to see similar content, then I guess liking the video and subscribing to the channel would help me a lot. That's about it, soldiers. I am out!